Okay, this is slide 6 in our World War I unit, U.S. fighting. Now that we have an army and we have trained our army, let's get them into the fighting. First of all, how they're going to be fighting. World War I, we've mentioned this a little before, and we'll talk about it some more in class. But World War I will see new weapons introduced to warfare. Machine gun, although it's been around before, but really the most efficient version of it comes now. So machine guns are relatively new. Tanks are new. Poison gas is new. Airplanes are new to warfare, and submarines. So we've got several different new types of weapons. Machine guns, tanks, poison gas, airplanes, submarines that we're all going to see in this war. So we have troops fighting with new weapons but using old-style tactics, sort of trench warfare, lining up, marching at each other. And when you do that with with new weapons, it turns to be particularly deadly. Also, we see trench warfare here, and we'll talk about that in class. So if you remind me, we'll talk about trench warfare and no man's land, charging across no man's land at a well-entrenched enemy is not a good way to fight. It's a recipe for disaster. And that's where kind of the Americans come into the fighting. The first use of Americans in fighting is as replacements in the trenches, in the lines, for the French and the British. And they simply get thrown into the fighting with very little training. Really, it's May of 1918 before the Americans do any fighting. Now think back, it's, let's see, April 1917 when we declare war. It's April 1918 before we send anybody to Europe. It's May 1918 before we do any fighting. And the war is going to be over by November. So about 6 months really is all that we're in the fighting. Let's see, May, June, July, August, September, October, November. 7 months. So we're not in the fighting very long. The first battle that Americans are involved in is the Battle of Chateau. Chateau. This is the first time that American troops have fought in a European war. We're going to see 4 different battles on here, and each of them has a significance to it that you're going to need to know. Chateau is the first time American troops have fought in a European war. They get thrown in at the last moment and help stop the Germans just short of taking Paris. About 40 miles outside the city, the Germans get stopped, thanks to the arrival of the Americans. The second battle here is actually the Second Battle of the Marne. Marne is a river. The Second Battle of the Marne marks the turning point of the war because it is the final German offensive. And the Allies are able to win it thanks to the addition of the Americans. So, turning point of the war, the final German offensive of the war. From this point on, Germany is fighting a defensive war. Now, that moves us into some U.S. victories. It is after the Second Battle of the Marne that General Pershing decides that Americans are no longer just going to get thrown into the slaughter as replacements here. If we are going to go fight in Europe, we are going to fight as Americans, under the American flag. We're not joining other nations here. And Pershing says, his tactics here, Pershing says, we're not coming over here to fight and die in trenches like you have. We're going to fight a different type of war. We're going to fight a quick moving war, hit-and-run tactics, being mobile. We're not hunkering down in a trench and marching at the enemy, waiting with them waiting for us. So Pershing says if we're going to fight our own way. And the first time that happens is the Battle of Saint-Mihiel. We're up to September 1918, and the battle at Saint-Mihiel marks the first time the Americans have won a victory on their own. It's the first American victory in the war. We're not fighting with the French or with the British. Saint-Mihiel is the first American victory as an independent unit in the war. Okay? Our fourth battle that we're going to mention is the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. Meuse-Argonne. The Meuse is a river that runs through the Argonne forest. Okay? And the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne will be the last battle for the Americans. We're into November 1918, just before the surrender. So it's the last big battle of the war. It's the biggest battle for the Americans. It will see more than 1 million American soldiers involved in the Argonne forest. And fighting is particularly brutal. It is the deadliest battle of the war for the Americans. About 120,000 were killed. Okay? So this is the last battle, the biggest, the deadliest battle for the Americans. Okay? Now, let's talk for a moment here about a man named Alvin York. And here you see a picture of Alvin right there. Alvin will be the greatest American war hero. Okay? He's a backwoods boy from the mountains of East Tennessee. Doesn't really believe in fighting, believe in warfare, but he goes anyway. He is a marksman. He's a sharpshooter from growing up in the mountains, having to hunt for food. So Alvin goes off to war and then surprises everybody. When his unit is pinned down by German machine gunners, Alvin York single-handedly kills 20 Germans and captured 132 more by himself. It's a cool story. If you remind me in class, I'll tell you about it. But Alvin York, Tennessee boy turned American hero, the greatest hero of the war for the Americans. Now, speaking of Americans and soldiers and all of that, the American Army in World War I is known as the AEF. Stands for American Expeditionary Force. The American Expeditionary Force. First of all, they're Americans. Two, they're going on an expedition, a trip, a journey, and they're a force, military force to be reckoned with. So the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, the American Army, this is what they are collectively known as, the American Expeditionary Force. Okay? Now, two more names that you're going to need to know here. We said at the beginning of this slide, airplanes will be used as a weapon for the first time, and two big names that you're going to need to know. The first one is a German, Manfred von Richthofen. Manfred von Richthofen. You see him here, the picture just to the right of his name there. He is known as the Red Baron. Paints his plane bright red, daring people to shoot him down. He will have 80 confirmed kills, or he will shoot down 80 enemy planes in the war. Okay? That is by far more than anybody else. He was the ace of aces here, the air ace. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. Okay? Now, his American counterpart is a man named Eddie Rickenbacker. Eddie Rickenbacker, and there you see Eddie with his plane right there. Eddie Rickenbacker was the greatest American ace of the war. He had 26 confirmed kills, or shot down 26 enemy planes. He probably, if you just look at time spent in the war, we consider Richthofen was in the whole thing for about 5 years and shot down 80 planes. Eddie Rickenbacker's in the war only about 7-8 months or so, and shoots down 26 planes. So maybe Rickenbacker's a better pilot, we're not sure. Rickenbacker will live to see the end of the war. Richthofen will not. The greatest air ace of the war, the Red Baron, will end up being shot down and killed. Not by another enemy pilot. He was in a dogfight over the trenches, and a soldier in the trench, as the planes were flying low overhead, chasing each other. A soldier in the trench fires his rifle just sort of randomly up in the air at the planes, and will shoot and kill the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. So a rather, unfortunate ending there for Richthofen. But anyway, remember, the U.S. doesn't contribute a lot of fighting victories here, just because we come into the war very late. But we do make a name for ourselves, and will help the Allies win the war.